Okay, I'm Karen Strawn. I am a working class, divorced mother of 3, and I come from a solid working class background. And I fall completely outside the spectrum of feminism. I don't, there are some things that feminists espouse that I do agree with, but I do not agree with the bulk of feminism and feminist thought. And that is what I have made sort of my mission over the last 3 to 4 years, is just exploring what the world is like, what the world of gender is like, what our natures are like, and how feminism has got it wrong, and is how they've misdiagnosed the problem, and how they are attempting to apply a harmful cure to a problem that maybe doesn't exist or maybe is not curable. So that's where I'm coming from. So there you go.
Thank you, Karen. Naomi?
Thank you. I just want to say first thank you for inviting me, because I'm so honored to be part of this. I've been sort of angling for an invitation for years. And you know, of all the places in America where there are people doing things that matter about the issues that matter, this is ground zero of change and important. So I could not be more honored. Now, who am I? I'm a writer and a mom and a single mom, and I usually write about women's issues. And what is that? I've written about childbirth, I've written about anorexia and beauty ideals, I've written about growing up female and the challenges about that, and wonderful things. But I also more recently have written about civil liberties, which is probably why I'm here. I wrote a book called The End of America about the growing police state, and a sequel called Give Me Liberty about what you can do about the growing police state, which you are actually doing and teaching me more things for and about.
It might be like I consult them once in a while, and I'm like, oh, we should be doing this.
Yes. Oh, good, good. I'm so glad. And so about feminism, I identify as a feminist, but I really want to stress that I think that there are a million definitions, and many of them are wrong. And that for me, how I like to define it, and I am going to agree with Karen probably about a lot of things, there are a lot of ways recent feminism, some spokespeople have kind of gone into a ditch ideologically, which we can get into. So I'm interested in redeeming the original vision of feminism, which I think a lot of you here would agree with, which was Mary Wollstonecraft's vision, came out of the Enlightenment, where a lot of liberty ideals came out of, and it was basically the idea that everyone on the planet is entitled to be free, and everyone on the planet is entitled to live out his or her full potential and be an individual without constraints of gender. So that doesn't mean there aren't differences. It's just about potential and dignity and human freedom. So that's my definition of feminism. Thank you.
I'm Antigone Darling. I am a podcaster. I talk into a microphone on a weekly basis, so doing that. It's called Sex, Lies, and Anarchy. I end up talking a lot about feminism and gender issues, probably because I'm a woman, so people ask me about that. I have a friend of mine who told me, yeah, you're a feminist because you're a woman, and you're a strong, independent woman, and hence you're a feminist. Like, there are so many problems with you saying that right now. On the spectrum, I'm a fan of both the ladies up here, and what Naomi just said makes her sound like an anarchist. So
now we just have to talk about the sex part.
So yeah, I don't know where I'll be on the spectrum, but I don't think anyone would disagree that everyone should live a life of dignity. But the dictionary, as a friend of mine likes to point out, the dictionary says that feminism is the idea that women should have equal rights to men, and I don't think men have enough rights, so that's where I am.
That's really well put.
Well, and I think ultimately that is probably where we're going to end up, but I'd like to explore some ideas because someone promised me a riot. So, we got to...
it was a cat fight.
No, see, it would be a cat fight. It was all girls, but we got a lot of boys, so we need a riot.
Oh, okay. But there's all
Actually, we're
girls up
very
here.
non-violent people, of course.
Yeah.
And so, one of the questions that sort of came up, and I think because so many of us are on the liberty spectrum, sort of interested in how do we gain more freedom and what are better tools to get there, and is feminism perhaps a good or a bad tool? And I won't say what I think about that, but I'm sure a lot of people here know. But we have had in the past, as Antigone said, you know, men don't have enough rights. So we know women don't have enough rights because, you know, we have the structure of the state. But there were certain things that women were granted, I guess. You know, once you're talking about rights, it sort of gets complex. But there were things that libertarianism or more freedom gave to women. And some of it was, hey, you guys gave us the vote. No, personally, I'm like, I don't think voting is such a great solution to anything. But thank you, overlords. You know, it gave us the ability to own property. It gave us the ability to get divorced, by way of example. So if we're going to assume that the government should grant rights in these ways, then they should grant them equally. Are there some things that you think are issues now, and where would you see feminism going? So I'm going to direct that to Naomi first.
Wow, you mean, are you asking me, are there issues that should be tackled because there's gender inequity? Is that what you mean by issues?
Sure, yeah, let's go with that.
Okay. So I guess the first thing I would say, so classical feminist analysis that I actually do agree with from the 70s would say that if you only look at the state giving and taking away rights, you're missing an important insight, which I think was valuable, which is that sometimes there can be rights taken away by individuals between each other, for instance, in a domestic context or a sexual violence context. For instance, in India right now, there's a huge grassroots movement, I was just in India, where women and men are taken to the streets because women are raped violently in the street and no one is safe walking the street. And it's not the state engaging in those rapes, right? But the women are petitioning the state to create more fair laws and more police taking it seriously and so on. Same with domestic violence. A feminist analysis of the 70s was that if a culture gives men, or I would say any group, but in this case, the example is men as a whole, the entitlement socially or culturally, not just through the law, to beat up women, and the culture says, well, that's your lot, or be a good wife, or put up with it, or be silent, that's a form of taking away rights or injustice that is just as serious as if the state takes away your rights. I do think that's an important insight. I would add to you that a woman can beat up a man, a woman can beat up a child. You know, there's no gendering of injustice or cruelty.
There is, though.
Well, okay, do you mind if I just
go ahead,
finish this and then...
Hey, riot time!
But I just want to stress for the purposes here, so we make the best use of our time, that there's not a single thing I believe about feminism or the world that's all men or all women. I don't see the world that way. I see human beings just as you do. So now, what are the issues ahead that feminism, when I say feminism, for a community like this, what I think it could be valuable from feminism is a tool of analysis, right? Not a prescription. And so an interesting tool of analysis for a liberty community that you could take from feminism is, for instance, well, gee, this is tough. You know, if indeed women are still making 20 cents less than men are for doing the same work, and that impedes their ability to create movements like this, to contribute, to run for office, to generate, you know, their own destiny. There's an analysis you could use of how the society can keep getting away with that. And there are other cool things that feminism does, like look at how culture takes away certain kinds of freedom of thought, right? Like the beauty myth was about that. Like if you're raised to think that only one way of being beautiful is possible, that affects your self-esteem, your courage, your sense of value about yourself. That's a great insight, whether you're male or female or call yourself a feminist or not. for a liberty community to look around and think, well, how is the culture bombarding us with messages, not just laws, but books, movies, songs, about compromise and obedience? And how are renegades and pioneers and dissidents seen in the culture and in the news media these days, right? These are not just what's the government doing. This is a feminist, it's a tool from feminism that you can now apply to any kind of analysis. So those are two examples I would give.
That's great. Karen, it looked like you wanted to jump in there.
I did. You know, like, honestly, in 1904, Theodore Roosevelt started a campaign to bring back the whipping post. And he wanted to bring it back as a punishment exclusively for men who beat their wives. And the reason he wanted to use the whipping post to punish men who beat their wives was because if a man was jailed for wife battering, his wife might suffer hunger or want. And if he was fined for wife battering, she might suffer hunger or want. Okay? But if he got 30 lashes at the public post, he could still go to work the next day, and he could still support her, right? Now, we have this idea that before feminism came along in the 60s and 70s, that domestic violence against women was completely socially acceptable. Now, I don't understand how one can come to that conclusion when the President of the United States wanted to bring back corporal punishment, which had been banned, right, in most states at that time, exclusively to punish men who batter their wives. And especially since the treatment in communities for men who were battered by their wives, of which there were many, and you can see friezes and artwork from the 1600s and the 1700s that show women battering their husbands with their rolling pins and their skillets and all of that. Robbie Burns' Ode to a Henpecked Husband. All of those things. There were women who were abusive to men at that time. And the treatment that the community gave those men was either the Skimmington Ride, which was the practice of the community coming around the house at night and beating pots and pans and screaming and throwing things at the house to shame him for allowing himself to be beaten by his wife. Or they put him on a donkey backwards, holding its tail, and rode him around the town square and threw, or strapped him to a cart, and threw rotten fruit and vegetables at him to shame him for allowing his wife to beat him, okay? And these things have been just quietly erased from modern scholarship and modern accounts of history, right? Back when we thought it was okay to beat your wife, right? When we thought it was okay to beat your wife, at least when it was extremely egregious, particularly egregious, we'd strap the guy to a whipping post and give him 30 lashes. When your wife was beating you, right, it was you that got punished by the community, right? So I don't know that feminism has a balanced perspective on any of these things. I really don't.
Well, I think there are several issues here, and part of it is I notice the word henpecked, and I think that, you know, language is important, and as liberty activists, certainly I think our best tool in our arsenal is persuasion. And so, you know, it's important to think about words and to say that, you know, was that a fair word even to use?
Well,
right?
okay, what's a cockfight? A cockfight is two roosters pecking each other to death, right? You know, when you're talking about chickens, pecking is violence, right?
But maybe the issue here is not so much male on female violence or female on male violence or chicken on chicken violence.
It shouldn't be gendered, but it is.
But, right?
It's seen as gendered.
And so maybe the exploration over the long term should be, how do we and can we move away from, and do we want to move away from sort of feminism language to a language that addresses the same issues from an individualist standpoint? So if we actually started to look at the question as individualism and violence instead of male and female, would that further this dialogue?
Yeah, I mean, respectfully, you know, with all due respect, I don't know of any feminists anymore, maybe in the 70s when there were a lot of bad ideas around, but I don't know of any feminists who work on domestic violence who don't take seriously, 17% of boys have been sexually abused before they're 18, and 30% of girls, and every feminist I know who works on domestic violence cares about boy victims as much as girl victims. And the same thing with domestic violence. We call it domestic violence instead of wife beating now because we recognize that it's gender neutral. Anyone can be in an abusive relationship. I think that with all respect, your ideas are a little out of date.
That's not my experience of feminism even today. I have conversations daily online with feminists who have taken women's studies, they've taken gender studies, and they will repeat that 95% of domestic violence is male on female perpetrated. I actually, there was a report by the Ottawa Council on Violence Against Women. And they took data from a Stats Canada study that showed 585,000 male victims and 601,000 female victims of domestic violence who had reported that they had been assaulted in the last 5 years. And when they did their study, they reported it as 1.2 million Canadian women.
I don't know what to say about that. I haven't seen the study, but I guess, can I just say something? Like, there's, all the studies show that young men in their 20s commit by far the most acts of violence, whether it's arson or, beating people up in bars or whatever. I don't think that that's I don't think that's what we should spend our precious time on, like who's the gender of the perpetrator. I think what we should spend our precious time on is stopping violence in the home, and when there's an insight about gender that could help us address that, that's what we should focus on positively rather than casting blame. Here's an example. There's this great organization called Man Up, which is global now, and they are enlisting men, which I think is the next wave of feminism, if you want to know where I think it should go.
Great.
And they enlist men, especially young men all over the world, to engage in fighting rape and sexual assault and domestic violence against women. And it's incredibly effective, and it's having fantastic outcomes, and it's teaching young men wonderful new ways of being a man and how to define successful masculinity. It's standing up against people hurting, women and children, or other men. And I guess I'd like to focus on, well, what's the point I'm making is that organization came about through an analysis of gender inequity or gender distortion in those societies, and an analysis that led people to think, well, here in, Rwanda, there's all this rape and war. How can we raise the next generation to not think, rape and war is an okay thing to do? And they're successful. And to me, like, we're about making a world that's better, right? That's what we're here for. And life is so short. So with all due respect, I would much rather focus on how we can work together and learn together rather than pointing fingers at, at the past, especially.
Okay, well, but okay,
Hold on,
so
hold
man
on.
up. What is man up other than pointing fingers?
I'm the moderator.
Okay.
I would like Antigone to jump in here.
It seems to me that this is more a conversation about violence rather than about genders. And I don't like the name feminism because it's not about women. It's about everyone.
I don't like the name man up.
And at the same time, I'm not as knowledgeable about Rwanda or India, and I'm not going to have examples outside of America, unfortunately. That's my bad. I'm embarrassed. But in schools, we have little boys who are punished for rambunctious behavior.
Yeah, that's not right.
I think this country has a big problem with masculinity,
Yeah.
and a big problem with medicating children.
I agree with you totally.
And with feminism focusing on just girls, with just even the name of it, I think is a problem. I think it's interesting to look at violence in the past. I think as people exchange more ideas, meet different people, I mean, racism was accepted before, but we've got the internet now. We're all one, and we're over that, right? Yeah. For the most part. Because if someone says something racist around anyone that I know, like that, you just put yourself in the racist box. We don't talk to people like you, that we've gone past. But I think a lot of the issues that come up with feminism were actually brought upon by the state. So I actually disagree with what Carla said probably 20 minutes ago at this, at this point. I should have jumped in there. But the state did not grant the right to vote.
That's true.
Or the right to own property. In 1760 in Boston, 40% of taverns were owned by women. And then these like old white dudes with their powdered wigs came along and made all these laws. And women let them get away with that, so there's that. And then slowly, like, oh, you get the vote back. You know, women did have property. Then the government comes along where now they can't have property. And the only people that could vote were people that had enough wealth to be taxed. Then men got the vote because they could be conscripted. So you've got people giving up their property, and then you've got people giving up their lives, and then women just kind of got it. I think they got it because of the temperance movement. So a lot of the feminists that they talk about in school, and a lot of this is going to go back to school, I'm not going to be able to pronounce her name, Mary Wollstonecraft. I have read about her before, but in school we hear about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and I keep talking about how we shouldn't talk about these people, and I actually forgot the other one. But the ones in history class that we learn about, the suffragettes, are the ones that had temperance as their #1 thing, which kind of goes back to what Karen was saying.
I mean, respectfully, that's not what their #1 thing was. It was the vote. They fought for 60 years to get the vote. And it was, the state didn't give women the vote. It was a grassroots movement like this one that fought and fought and fought. Women chained themselves to the state.
The state gave women the vote.
Eventually, women secured the vote from the state because the state has to validate your vote for your vote to be meaningful. But women fought and struggled for 3 generations to demand the vote. It wasn't something that was handed to them. That's
Women in Utah, in the Utah Territory, had the vote until 1887 when the federal government took it away again.
You're absolutely right.
Oh, do we see a big bad here, people?
Yeah.
Is there a big bad in this scenario?
You're right.
Okay.
And the sentiments of the Declaration of Sentiments.
Yes.
I read over that the other night, and everything, it was written really badly. It was like, he has taken this away. He, man, man, man. And I could easily go through that entire list and remove he and man, replace it with the state.
You could.
And it would totally make sense.
But we're confirming an insight that you helped us bring up a few beats ago, which is these ways of analyzing, interpersonal relations and the state versus the individual, they can intersect in really rich and important ways. In other words, it was new. Like, let's keep in mind history. I think it's very important for a movement like this to keep in mind history and how history flows. When they wrote the Declaration of Sentiments, it was brand new to have an analysis that there could be an oppressor in the home. It's such an old idea for us now that we're trying to move past it and think, well, that's a restrictive way to look at men and women. But at that time, it was revolutionary, right, for women to stand up. And we're in a liberty community. These women could not vote, could not own property, could not keep their children in a divorce. If they had there was a double standard for divorce. Men could divorce a woman for adultery. A woman had to say cruelty and sodomy and bigamy before they could get a divorce. They couldn't keep their own money. They could be whipped, and on and on and on. And so for them to stand up and say, he's oppressing us, and they also had plenty to say about the state, was very much in keeping, I think, with what you all are doing. It's very much part of the heritage. And I think we have to kind of make space for where they were 150 years ago, and that they hadn't finished the analysis, just like we haven't finished the analysis.
So
does that make sense, what I just said?
I want to sort of change.
Now men can't keep their kids, right?
Yeah, that's true.
We have completely gone the opposite. And whether or not men had as much control as you say or not, today women have.
Which is not fair.
The main difference between what was before and what is now is that men got their kids because men were 100% financially responsible for their children, right? So when men got their kids, they got the entire bill, right? And then when the tender years doctrine came into effect and women started getting default custody, women got custody and men got the bill.
But this sort of, once again, from a liberty perspective, sort of circles back to the idea, if you take the decision makers that are the state out of the equation, how would we just on a individualist level deal with those issues. I mean, so much of what I'm hearing is really because, you know, we have the overlords who are like, oh, first you can't vote. Oh, we don't like black people. Now you can vote. Now we can, I mean, the whole canard really of the state just comes to light, I think, in feminism. It's actually a really good way to show sort of the problem with the state, because ultimately we have to decide, are we going to, you know, keep writing laws that start to protect certain groups over other groups, or how do we proceed forward?
Well, all feminists should be anarchists. In New Hampshire, it's allowed when you're going through a divorce to have a mediator. In some states, you can't do that. You need to involve lawyers. You know, if you're getting divorced, you did love that person at some point. And then when you involve lawyers and judges, there are people that I know that have tried to have an amicable divorce, but then the state gets in the way. So, I mean, that would be a great movement there. All feminists just work on abolishing the state.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that's going to happen because, you know, if you look at the National Organization for Women and their extended, long history of advocacy against shared parenting legislation. Shared parenting being a...
What's their position now today?
Their position now today is they still oppose it.
They oppose shared parenting?
They oppose any legislation that would impose a rebuttable presumption of shared parenting, right? Any kind of
Is shared parenting what it sounds like?
Shared parenting after divorce would be, you know, 50-50, 60-40 custody time, right? Sure. You know.
Are you sure that's not in the case of the guy being abusive or
no,
violent?
what they're saying is they will not support any legislation that would make the starting point in a divorce be that if neither parent is unfit and both parents want it, shared parenting is the starting point.
I mean, I have to see that citation because that does not sound right to me.
I have citations. You just have to
email it to me.
Yeah, I will. Okay. And they have been, and I actually talked to an advocate for shared parenting, and she's been lobbying about this for the last 15 years, right? As she spoke to me on Skype from Washington, D.C., night before last, after a round of 4 days of 5 meetings a day, right, in Washington. And she said, everywhere I go, there are feminists there opposing me, right? And I am there to propose basically legislation that, I mean, if feminists didn't oppose it, why don't we have it?
That's
right?
a nonsensical
because
sentence.
80% of anywhere between 60 and 80%, depending on where you are, between 60 and 80% of the general population in polls support shared parenting legislation.
I mean, can I ask you something? I live in New York and I'm divorced. Everybody I know shares custody of their children. I don't know anyone who could say to their lawyer, he can't have the kids more than I can have the kids unless they're like a drug addict or violent. I don't know what world you're living in.
You are a wealthy woman.
I'm actually not, but thanks for that stereotyping, insulting assumption about my income.
Oh yeah.
You have, you know, you can afford to live in New York. Frankly,
you have no idea what my personal circumstances are.
Okay, all right.
I am jumping in here because that's what a good moderator would do, right?
If you actually look outside your sphere, right, of your friends, I know a whole bunch of people who, I know.
This is not about money, it's about the law. The law in New York doesn't let women take their kids more than men take their kids.
I mean, I think,
it just doesn't.
We don't want to focus on the anecdotal because we all have stories.
Yeah. But basically what it is the National Organization for Women has consistently opposed this, and they have opposed it on the basis that it, number one, would endanger women and children because the men might be abusive. Right?
I mean, I'd have to see this text. I've never seen
Are we assuming that NOW kind of represents feminists?
They're the largest feminist organization in the U.S.
to call them to account if they do.
In college, which was like a decade ago, I read an official statement from NOW that said, all fathers' rights groups are pederasts.
Oh my God.
Yeah, no,
It was official from
Yeah.
now.
Jesus.
So
Yeah.
guess how many
This was
times
in
I listened to
in
now.
College? In college?
Yes.
Like it was an actual source?
Oh,
Because
There
there's
was-
a lot of nonsense on the internet, too, that it attributes to feminist
It was
things that
online
Michigan
and an
Action
official
Alert.
public, so I don't listen to them anymore.
Michigan National
All right.
Organization Action Alert
I think we're,
alerting
like,
us to
the
the fact that
journalist
they're
in
an
me is
abusers lobby.
uncomfortable. I have to say, the journalist in me is uncomfortable with this because we're saying, oh, there's all this positioning, but we don't have any evidence. Can someone just Google National Organization of Women and what's their position on shared parenting? And do they say men's groups are pederasts? I mean, please.
It basically says, and it was a Michigan one that said this, that they.
Do we have a hand mic? Hold on a sec. Or actually, if you want to come up, we have this mic. Let's not make it an operation. Oh, wait, they've got one.
I actually already Googled off that particular page, but it said they oppose forced shared parenting.
But none of the legislation would force shared parenting.
I'm just saying what they said.
But see,
No,
this
but they
is a big
oppose the
difference.
legislation.
Can we just say there's a big
They
difference?
oppose
She's
the
the footnote,
legislation.
that's all.
They oppose the legislation by portraying it as something that would be forced.
I mean, she just has the citation.
Yeah.
We really, can I just say something about accuracy and sourcing? And I'm saying this from the heart, and it's with respect to you, okay? It's so important for citizens to act as journalists in a time when the police state is cracking down on us. And what I mean by that is, we're so bombarded with propaganda and spin. It is so crucial for every single one of you to not leave it to the gatekeepers, not leave it to the journalists or editors, but to take yourselves as journalists and editors so seriously and value truth and accuracy and check data, check your facts. Don't take anything, by anyone's assertion. Don't take it on faith. Check it for yourself and really respect evidence and facts, because otherwise we live in China. We live in a police state where everybody's at the mercy
that's
we
of
live in a
government
world where
forces.
bonsai kittens are real.
Okay,
Do
but
you guys
but,
remember bonsai kittens?
But you
Anyone?
look at it and you say, like this. They had this come up in Australia where a single mothers group, right? A single mothers advocacy group went and wrote an entire article about why such and such bill about shared parenting was a bad idea. And they basically said that it would enforce shared parenting, that it would apply even if the father was abusive, that blah, 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 that it would force this arrangement of 50-50 custody, physical custody on parents even if it wasn't workable, even if the man worked in camp and he was gone 2 weeks out of every 3.
I feel like
right?
we're going to get into...
And they're completely misrepresenting the legislation.
You can
right?
criticize that group, but that's not a criticism of feminism. I'm sitting here and I'm confused as to what feminism is. I know what the dictionary definition of it is, and I already saw that. And I was pretty much thinking I didn't agree with any of the feminists from the 60s and 70s. I read this article written by Susan Faludi about, I'm gonna get this wrong, Shumalith Firestone.
Good enough.
And she had some great comments there, and one of them was that the state treats women like children. And then that, of course, would follow that the state treats men that same way, and that's really screwed up that they treat children like children.
Right,
also.
that's true.
So, I want to read more of her stuff. And so does that mean anything about the feminists of that decade?
I'm really glad you're asking this, Antigone, because I really want to say I don't think there is any one such thing as feminism, just like there's not any one such thing as libertarianism or anarchism or any one liberty movement. And that's as it should be. In a real democracy, there are a million feminisms, as many as there are thinking men and women who are thinking about gender or the issues that it raises. And the other thing I'd like to say, just on the record, especially for this community whose progress I value so much, is here we are. In 1962, when I was born, women couldn't go to the university I went to. They couldn't be Rhodes Scholars, and I went to, whatever. I had a lot of free education that I couldn't afford. On scholarship, and they couldn't get credit in their own name. They couldn't leave an abusive, relationship, and on and on and on. And now here we are, and like half of us here are women, and we assume, and our daughters assume, they can do what they want. They'll have equal rights, at least in the law. They can run for office and be president. They can change things. you know, and even from the early 90s when I was a baby feminist to now when I've got an 18-year-old daughter, my daughter's assumptions about what's open to her are so much bigger than, you know, even when I began my career. And this is important for us because we're trying to create a revolution, and we need to believe that change is possible. And so the fact that, you know, feminism, you know, women and men fought for all of these changes and believed in the world that could be, and we're really inheriting those rights and freedoms. You may not agree with how they did it, you may not think it's relevant, but the lesson's important for the liberty movement because it means you can change the world.
Great. So would it be fair to say, and it probably won't be, but I'll say it anyway, that possibly like the next wave of feminism, what I heard here to some extent was, hey, the problem is the state. The state used to be a bunch of old dudes. The state has now evolved where because we have women's rights, you know, the state, the government, the people making the decisions are now, you know, half men, half women. Maybe, and you know, if we push feminism to its logical conclusion, maybe, you know, in 20 years, it'll be all women running the state because it used to be all men running the state. And so the question really becomes is, what is the problem, right? What is actually the problem here? I see Jeff doing a... Okay. I thought you had something to contribute. But we have
women are just as evil as men.
Oh no,
this whole like
that.
fair sex thing.
But I think, you know, ultimately, I think in some ways where feminism sort of emerged from was a power structure that at the time looked like a power structure between men and women, because that was the actual power structure at that time.
It was between wealthy, property-owning men of the correct European descent. I mean, it's not men.
I think it was when society became a little bit more prosperous and people's lives were a little bit easier and they weren't working, the working class weren't working 16 hours a day just to survive. I think that was when the divide occurred between men and women, where women started to say this isn't fair, and you know, and it occurred in the upper classes first, right? It occurred in the upper classes first, where women looked around and said, why can't I be a barrister like my father? Rather than, why can't I work 14 hours a day in a coal mine like my husband?
Can I just say, I have to say, you know, and I keep saying with respect, but I guess I need to just be really honest. Your facts just are not right. That's not historically the origin of feminism. I'm sorry. Women have been, working class women, women in mines, women in factories, women in service, have been fucking complaining about gender injustice ever since they could speak. And this is in the record. And, you know, I can give you the citations.
Women in mines, women in factories who would rather not have been there.
Of course. But they were noticing that they were paid a fraction of what the men in the mines were paid.
And they were shoveling coal onto lorries when the men were going down underground.
All I'm saying is that you're imagining a world in which these privileged women invented feminism when there was time, and I'm saying...
I have never said that working class women invented feminism.
Well, no, I'm saying working class women did invent feminism.
I don't think so. I think the working class women were too busy getting by.
Well, all I can say is I'm happy to send you a list of sources and records. That my point is, human beings have been fighting oppression ever since they could speak.
I don't think those women felt oppressed by their husbands.
Oh my God.
I really don't.
Okay.
They felt oppressed by a lot of things, but they felt oppressed by their husbands. They were oppressed by, you know, working in houses where they were raped by their employers. They were oppressed by, if they had any sexual experience, they could never marry, and so they had to become prostitutes, and then they were used up and couldn't make a living, and then they had to go to the workhouses. They were oppressed by pregnancies they couldn't avoid. They were oppressed by not being able to get access to contraception.
And men were oppressed by being pressed into service in the Merchant Marines, and they were oppressed by being drafted into war, and they were oppressed by being forced and being jailed if they failed to provide the necessities of life to their wives.
I mean, like, you know what,
it's not the oppression Olympics. It was shit for everybody. That's not gender oppression.
But our goal is to make it better. So I think we only have about 7 minutes left, I believe. I think we're going to have some questions from the audience. I would like to keep the responses from the panelists down to maybe a sentence or two. Let's see if we can get a couple of people. I mean, unless you want to roll, but I think we're on the clock and we have lots of hands. And let's make them sound bites. You guys can just, we won't make it a cat fight. We'll make it a snappy, sound bitey fight. All right, so I'm going to go with Phil first, and we have a microphone, so please use that.
All right. Thank you. I think a lot of these issues have gotten much, much better over time, and the experience, my mother was involved in feminism in the 50s when it was just starting, when she was majoring in biology and chemistry and couldn't get her classes because they were later than the dorm curfew, and was the only woman in most of her classes. And now that has much improved, but I still notice, I work in the pharmaceutical industry, and on the West Coast and on the East Coast where I work, women are often in positions of power. They run departments. They're about equal in the workplace. But I did a year in Ohio a couple years ago, and it was still very pronounced that the men ran everything and the women were in subservient positions. So we're not all the way there yet, but I think that's the kind of equality that we're talking about and the good part of feminism. And my mom got out of the feminism movement in the late 60s when it started to get all tangled up with the hippies and the socialism and got co-opted by a whole different agenda. Right. So my question would be, do we try to move the feminism movement back towards women and away from the socialism thing, or do we look for an alternate movement that is focused on the right things?
I love your question. Can I speak to this, or am I talking too much?
No.
I love your question. That's exactly the right question. I'm always saying to my, whatever demographic of feminists who tend to be liberal, because that's the world I came from, though I identify as much more libertarian now. That there are a million different feminisms. There are going to be conservative feminists, and they're real. There are religious feminists. There are military feminists. There are libertarian feminists. There are anarchist feminists. And what's beautiful to me about that is that, first of all, it creates many, many more good ideas. And again, in a democracy, you need all those ideas. And also, feminism, if you take it by Mary Wollstonecraft's definition, isn't an agenda. Like your word was so right, an agenda, right? It shouldn't be a list of, are you a vegetarian? How do you vote? Do you believe in abortion? It should be a belief that everyone is entitled to equal rights. And then what you do with that is a different set of policies or outcomes depending on your perspective, and then you fight it out, which is how democracy should work. So I don't think you should drag feminism anywhere. I think this community should develop its own version of what it thinks we should do about gender issues, if you see any of them, and that will enrich everything. And if you want to call it feminism, fine, and if you don't, that's fine. And the whole point is, we're men and women, so let's take women and men seriously because we're here on the planet together.
Well, they're from Mars and we're from Venus.
That book was not useful. Not that I've read.
Amanda. Right over here. You know what's fun is when you know everyone's names in the audience. I can just be like, yo.
Okay, so I reject feminism as an entire ideology. And so I would just want to get from each of you just in like one quick answer. As a female who rejects feminism, what does that make me?
An anarchist?
An individualist?
I mean, I agree. I hate labels, and I think you should define yourself and not ask us to define you. You're in charge of yourself.
I mean, we could have called this panel. Sorry, Antigone, go. I'm so bad.
Well, our mutual friend Andre the other day, he's the one who said, well, you're a strong, independent woman, hence you must be a feminist, which I did not like. I've been called a self-hating woman because I don't call myself a feminist. And I just asked Andre, okay, I'm of Portuguese descent, so does that mean anything I do is for like Portuguese supremacy? Right? So everything I do that's kind of cool, it becomes a feminist cause? I don't think it's useful.
I think that if I were to ask you a checklist of your beliefs, like, do you believe women should be paid equally to men? Do you believe women should be free from being raped? Do you believe that women should have representation in government? I suspect.
I would have answered no to all of them.
All of them. You don't think women should be free from being raped?
That's what I'm getting at is.
Microphone. Stand up, please.
I think was your first question about like equal pay and whatnot.
Yeah.
What I think is that the maximum freedom will be achieved for anyone, women included, when they have the right to negotiate their own contracts.
Okay, that's
so
great.
I don't believe that there should be some wage equality imposed upon
okay.
anyone. I
I
believe
agree
that
with
everyone should have the right to negotiate their own contracts.
And
Okay.
to speak to the...
So that's a great answer. I mean, I'm sorry.
and and I agree with her there. And also, Thomas Sowell, I think, said this, where when he looked at the degrees that people have, etc., women actually make 103% of what men make nowadays.
If they've never been married and if they have never had kids.
Yeah, if it all matches up. The free from being raped thing, it's amazing to me that we haven't talked about rape culture, which is, this new invention of the last 2 or 3 years. I don't know if you've heard of it. But the freedom from being raped, like, I'm not free from being murdered, like, right now.
Yeah, no, or robbed.
I'm not,
or
like, free from... Neither one of us have the porcupine quills.
I don't know.
who knows what's going to happen?
It's just kind of an odd idea to say, like...
libertarians.
I'd like to really speak to that. Free from being raped. What I mean is, only 6% of reported rapes are ever prosecuted, and there's no statistics of how many of that 6% ever go to prison. So my point is, rapists have impunity, but people who murder people don't have impunity in our culture. And
Sure they do. Once the people start murdering the rapists, we'll have a good little cycle.
If you look at the nature of the crime, though, look at the nature of the crime, right? It's a crime that is a legal act that millions of people have every day that is only designated as a crime because of two states of mind.
You're a rape apologist? You're saying rape is okay?
No. Two states of mind. Two states of mind. Her lack of consent, his awareness of her lack of consent. That is all the evidence of rape is evidence of a legal act.
All right, we're going to another question.
Other than her testimony and his testimony. Other than that, it's a very, very difficult thing to prove. It's a very difficult thing to disprove.
How are we on time, guys? I think we're close.
Killing somebody's always
35.
illegal.
Okay, we're 5 minutes over already. So who here thinks they have the most awesome question to wrap all of this up?
My question is very simple, actually, because it speaks to the whole issue of feminism as a political agenda. What current legal disabilities currently exist in the law that work against women that need to be addressed from a political point of view? Just very precisely. I mean, what is left for feminism to do?
I think there's very little research into reproductive issues. 62% of American women are on hormonal birth control. That affects your behavior, that affects your brain. Meanwhile, in Europe, there's an IUD with no hormones on it. The FDA has not approved it for American use. Want to go to Italy? Let's go. That's ridiculous. That is a very significant number of women.
Did an avowed anarchist just suggest that the state should regulate IUDs? Because
the entire reason I can't purchase one is because of the FDA.
That's why we have the internet.
Oh, right, Silk Road. What happened to that? Silk Road,
Bitcoin. We can beat them at their own game.
But you have to get that thing installed.
Also, 25% of American women are on antidepressants. There are also more women on anti-anxiety meds. And I made a post about this like 2 days ago, that marijuana should be a feminist issue. There are way too many women on drugs in this country, and I'm not talking about the fun ones.
All right, so I think to wrap it up, just to keep things on time for the rest of the evening, and of course Naomi will be our keynote speaker later if she doesn't decide this was way too much. I'm so looking forward to it. I guess a few last thoughts if...
I do need to say something as someone with sexual violence in my background. For this community, when I said freedom from rape, I meant I want to live in a society where if, God forbid, your daughter or one of our daughters is raped, everybody is very concerned about it, doesn't blame her, and tries to put whoever did it away. You know, you don't believe in the state, I believe in prison for that guy.
We
And
carry
just
guns.
Bear with me. Well, good. That's good, because then you can defend my daughter.
Because guns are safer than rape whistles.
But I just want to say one thing about, yeah, that's
They're more effective than rape whistles, yeah.
good. Can I say one thing about freedom and PTSD? So 30% of women, 17% of men have experienced sexual abuse or assault. PTSD actually damps down your ability to have a consciousness of freedom. And I think it's a political weapon. I think like all these wars that send back, you know, traumatized veterans with PTSD is a way to keep the population quiescent and obedient. Yeah. So just in the interest of your liberty brain and my liberty brain, you know, I think rape is a freedom issue, and fighting rape and sexual assault and sexual abuse of children is a way to advance liberty. That's what I want to say.
All right. I think we'll call it a night. Yeah? But we got a lot of boys, so we need a riot.
Oh, okay.
Actually, we're very non-violent people, of course.
Yeah.
And so one of the questions that sort of came up, and I think because so many of us are on the liberty spectrum, sort of interested in how do we gain more freedom and what are better tools to get there, and is feminism perhaps a good or a bad tool? And I won't say what I think about that, but I'm sure a lot of people here know. But we have had in the past, as Antigone said, you know, men don't have enough rights. So we know women don't have enough rights because, you know, we have the structure of the state. But there were certain things that women were granted, I guess. You know, once you're talking about rights, it sort of gets complex. But there were things that libertarianism or more freedom gave to women. And some of it was, hey, you guys gave us the vote. No, personally, I'm like, I don't think voting is such a great solution to anything. But thank you, overlords. You know, it gave us the ability to own property. It gave us the ability to get divorced, by way of example. So if we're going to assume that the government should grant rights in these ways, then they should grant them equally. Are there some things that you think are issues now, and where would you see feminism going? So I'm going to direct that to Naomi first.
Wow, you mean, are you asking me, so that doesn't mean there aren't differences. It's just about potential and dignity and human freedom. So that's my definition of feminism. Thank you.
I'm Antigone Darling. I am a podcaster. I talk into a microphone on a weekly basis, so doing that. It's called Sex, Lies, and Anarchy. I end up talking a lot about feminism and gender issues, probably because I'm a woman, so people ask me about that. I have a friend of mine who told me, yeah, you're a feminist because you're a woman, and you're a strong, independent woman, and hence you're a feminist. Like, there are so many problems with you saying that right now. On the spectrum, I'm a fan of both the ladies up here, and what Naomi just said makes her sound like an anarchist. So
now we just have to talk about the sex part.
So yeah, I don't know where I'll be on the spectrum, but I don't think anyone would disagree that everyone should live a life of dignity. But the dictionary, as a friend of mine likes to point out, the dictionary says that feminism is the idea that women should have equal rights to men, and I don't think men have enough rights, so that's where I am.
That's really well put.
Well, and I think ultimately that is probably where we're going to end up, but I'd like to explore some ideas because someone promised me a riot. So, we got to...
it was a cat fight.
No, see, it would be a cat fight. It was all girls.
Of change and important. So I could not be more honored. Now, who am I? I'm a writer and a mom and a single mom, and I usually write about women's issues. And what is that? I've written about childbirth, I've written about anorexia and beauty ideals, I've written about growing up female and the challenges about that, and wonderful things. But I also more recently have written about civil liberties, which is probably why I'm here. I wrote a book called The End of America about the growing police state, and a sequel called Give Me Liberty about what you can do about the growing police state, which you are actually doing and teaching me more things for and about.
It might be like I consult them once in a while, and I'm like, oh, we should be doing this.
Yes. Oh, good, good. I'm so glad. And so about feminism, I identify as a feminist, but I really want to stress that I think that there are a million definitions, and many of them are wrong. And that for me, how I like to define it, and I am going to agree with Karen probably about a lot of things, there are a lot of ways recent feminism, some spokespeople have kind of gone into a ditch ideologically, which we can get into. So I'm interested in redeeming the original vision of feminism, which I think a lot of you here would agree with, which was Mary Wollstonecraft's vision, came out of the Enlightenment, where a lot of liberty ideals came out of, and it was basically the idea that everyone on the planet is entitled to be free, and everyone on the planet is entitled to live out his or her full potential and be an individual without constraints of gender. Are there issues that should be tackled because there's gender inequity? Is that what you mean?
Sure, yeah, let's go with that.
So I guess the first thing I would say, so classical feminist analysis that I actually do agree with from the 70s would say that if you only look at the state giving and taking away rights, you're missing an important insight, which I think was valuable, which is that sometimes there can be rights taken away by individuals between each other, for instance, in a domestic context or a sexual violence context. For instance, in India right now, there's a huge grassroots movement, I was just in India, where women and men are taking to the streets because women are raped violently in the street and no one is safe walking the street. And it's not the state engaging in those rapes, right? But the women are petitioning the state to create more fair laws and more police taking it seriously and so on. Same with domestic violence. A feminist analysis of the 70s was that if a culture gives men, or I would say any group, but in this case, the example is men as a whole, the entitlement socially or culturally, not just through the law, to beat up women, and the culture says, well, that's your lot, or be a good wife, or put up with it, or be silent, that's a form of taking away rights, or injustice, that is just as serious as if the state takes away your rights. I do think that's an important insight. I would add to you that a woman can beat up a man, a woman can beat up a child. You know, there's no gendering of injustice or cruelty.
There is, though.
Well, okay, do you mind if I just
go ahead,
finish this and then...
Hey, right!
Okay, I'm Karen Strawn. I am a working class, divorced mother of 3, and I come from a solid working class background. And I fall completely outside the spectrum of feminism. I don't, there are some things that feminists espouse that I do agree with, but I do not agree with the bulk of feminism and feminist thought. And that is what I have made sort of my mission over the last 3 to 4 years, is just exploring what the world is like, what the world of gender is like, what our natures are like, and how feminism has got it wrong and is, how they've misdiagnosed the problem and how they are attempting to apply a harmful cure to a problem that maybe doesn't exist or maybe is not curable. So that's where I'm coming from. So there you go.
Thank you, Karen. Naomi?
Thank you. I just want to say first thank you for inviting me, because I'm so honored to be part of this. I've been sort of angling for an invitation for years. And you know, of all the places in America, where there are people doing things that matter about the issues that matter, this is ground zero.